After over a year of speculation and rumors, OG Anunoby has finally been traded. Along with Precious Achiuwa and Malachi Flynn, OG Anunoby was traded to the New York Knicks in exchange for RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, and Detroit's 2024 second-round pick. I'm going to do a deep dive into this trade from all salary cap angles in a minute, but first I want to take a step back and look at just how improbable it was that this trade happened. But to appreciate just how improbable this trade was, we have to understand the history between these two front offices and franchises, because there were two major obstacles that would have made most pundits think that a trade between these two teams would have been highly unlikely. The first dates all the way back to 2011 when the New York Knicks acquired Carmelo Anthony from the Denver Nuggets. The consensus at the time was that Denver's GM, Masai Ujiri at the time, had fleeced the Knicks for a player that they could have signed as a free agent just a few months later. And since that trade, James Dolan, chairman of the New York Knicks, has made it clear that he doesn't want to make any trades with Masai Ujiri. He even went so far as to veto a trade back in 2013 that would have brought Kyle Lowry to New York because he was afraid of getting scammed by Masai Ujiri once again. And the second major obstacle is the fact that there is still a pending lawsuit between these two franchises. Let's not forget that the Knicks are currently suing the Toronto Raptors for $10 million in damages for the theft of proprietary information. According to the Knicks, former employee Ike Azotem, who's now the head of video and an assistant player development coach for the Toronto Raptors, stole a prep book, video scouting files, and more proprietary information that belonged to the Knicks, while the Raptors are claiming that Ike would have had access to this information anyway once he received his Raptors credentials. Regardless of the details, one would be pretty justified in thinking that a trade between these two franchises would be pretty unlikely at this time. And that's where one of the most powerful agencies in all of sports played a major factor in getting this deal done. You see, current president of the New York Knicks, Leon Rose, used to be the co-head of basketball at CAA. And although he left the agency over 3 years ago, his connections with CAA still run deep. In the past few years, the Knicks have acquired a plethora of CAA clients, including Jalen Brunson, Julius Randle, Isaiah Hartenstein, Obi Toppin, and Josh Hart. They also hired head coach Tom Thibodeau, along with assistant coaches Johnny Bryant and Rick Brunson, all of whom were CAA clients when the Knicks acquired them. And now another name to add to the list of CAA clients that the Knicks acquired, OG Anunoby. But in the case of OG Anunoby, not only is he represented by CAA, but he's more specifically represented by Sam Rose, which is the son of Leon Rose. So although New York's acquiring OG Anunoby, who could become a free agent in just 6 months, I think they feel pretty confident about their chances of retaining OG Anunoby long term. Now, let's get into the details of this trade and the cap implications for both teams. Before this trade, the New York Knicks were 19th in points allowed per possession, and now acquire one of the best wing defenders in the NBA to help them in that category. And the Raptors bring home former number 3 overall pick RJ Barrett, who will be only the 8th Canadian to ever play for the Toronto Raptors. They also bring in Emmanuel Quickley, who has the best plus-minus in New York Knicks history. He's played 253 games for them and was a plus 886. This season, with Emmanuel Quickley on the court, New York also had a net rating of plus 7.9. And with Emmanuel Quickley off the court, New York had a net rating of minus 5. So both teams are getting quality players, and time will tell if this ends up working out as a win-win for both teams. Now let's look at the details of their contracts. Including this season, RJ Barrett has 4 years and $107 million remaining. If we ignore this season, he has 3 years and $83 million remaining. And then entering the 27-28 season, he'll be an unrestricted free agent if he doesn't sign an extension before then. They also received Emmanuel Quickley, who's earning $4.2 million this season on a rookie scale contract. And then after this season, if he receives a qualifying offer, he'll become a restricted free agent. They also received the 2024 second round pick from Detroit, which is likely to be a pick in the low 30s. And some are saying that it's potentially more valuable than a very late first round pick, because they'll have more flexibility over the contract structure assigned to that player. From New York's perspective, they obviously received OG Anunoby, the centerpiece of this trade, along with Precious Achiuwa and Malachi Flynn, who can both become restricted free agents if given a qualifying offer. To become restricted free agents, Precious Achiuwa would have to be given a $6.3 million qualifying offer, and Malachi Flynn would have to receive a $5.8 million qualifying offer. Those players are both going to have to play very well to end the year to earn those qualifying offers. And from OG's perspective, all signs point to OG Anunoby declining his player option for next season because it really doesn't make financial sense. He can make much more by opting out. Here are OG Anunoby's options moving forward. Number 1, right now he can sign an extension which is capped due to the extended trade limits. So this extension is available right now all the way up until June the 29th. That would be a 2-year, $40.1 million extension. However, after 6 months, so on June the 30th, the final day of the season, OG Anunoby can sign a larger extension, which would be 4 years, $116.9 million. And then his final options would be not to sign an extension and instead explore free agency. As a free agent, OG Anunoby would really have two paths. One would be to re-sign with New York using his bird rights, and two would be to sign with a brand new team. His max contract with New York would be a 5-year, $247.1 million contract, and his max with a different team who wouldn't have any of his bird rights would be a 4-year, $185.2 million contract. Now, I don't expect him to get the full max, but I do imagine that New York would probably offer him somewhere between $30 to $35 million annually. Now let's take a look at how this trade affected both Toronto and New York's cap sheets. From Toronto's perspective, before the trade took place, they had $3.1 million of room under the luxury tax. And if we factor in some of the unlikely bonuses, that room would reduce all the way down to about $1.86 million. And then because they're hard capped at the first apron, we also want to take into account how much room they had under the first apron, and they had about $8.9 million of space. They also had a full roster of 15 players, so they didn't have any open roster spots. They couldn't receive any more players than they sent out. And when we look at the Toronto Raptors position after the trade, they're now down to $1.95 million in room underneath the luxury tax. However, that doesn't factor in some of the unlikely bonuses. If all the unlikely bonuses tied to their players were achieved, then the Toronto Raptors would actually end up $2.2 million over the luxury tax. And that's because in RJ Barrett's contract, he has $2.9 million of unlikely bonuses that he could essentially achieve if he was selected for the All-NBA team, the All-Star team, and the All-Defensive team. So the Raptors are assuming that he's not going to earn some of those incentives and that they will finish the season under the luxury tax. The Raptors also now have about $4.85 million of space under the first apron, and they're still capped at the first apron. Also, since the Raptors gave away 3 players and only received 2 players, they now also have 1 open roster spot. Another interesting thing to note with this trade is that if the Toronto Raptors didn't include both Precious Achiuwa and Malachi Flynn, then they would actually have ended up sitting over the luxury tax. This is what their cap sheet would have looked like if they didn't include Malachi Flynn. They would have ended up $1.9 million over the luxury tax. So the inclusion of Malachi Flynn was likely for Toronto Raptors' benefit and not so much for the New York Knicks' benefit. And now from the New York Knicks perspective, before the trade, they had about $2.7 million of room under the luxury tax. If you factor in all their unlikely bonuses, they could have been actually $2.4 million over the luxury tax. And they had $4.6 million of space under the first apron, and they are capped at the first apron. They also had 0 open roster spots, so they couldn't take back more players than they gave out. After the trade, they ended up with $5.1 million in space under the luxury tax since they received less salary than they gave out. And if all of their unlikely bonuses are achieved, then they would still be under the luxury tax by $2.85 million. They also have more space under the first apron at $9.9 million. They're still capped at the first apron, and they still ended with 0 open roster spots, and that's because they had to waive Daquan Jeffries in order to acquire the 3-for-2 in this trade. Now let's take a look at the trade math. So in this trade, Toronto sent out a total of $26.9 million and it was receiving a total of $28.1 million. From New York's perspective, the Knicks are sending out a total of $28.1 million and are receiving a total of $26.9 million. The value of the outgoing salaries and the incoming salaries are pretty even for Toronto and New York, so figuring out the trade math isn't too complicated, but they did manage to structure the trades in a way that created a trade exception for both teams, and I'm going to walk us through that. So as mentioned earlier, both New York and Toronto are capped at the first apron, so these are the trade rules that apply to both teams. If a team that is remaining below the apron after a trade takes place sends out between $0 and $7.5 million of salary, then the max incoming salary they can receive is 200% of the salary that they send out, plus $250,000. If the outgoing salary that the team sends out is between $7.5 and $29 million, then the incoming salary that they can receive is the amount of the outgoing salary plus an additional $7.5 million. And if the outgoing salary is over $29 million, which doesn't apply in this case, then the incoming salary that they can receive is 125% of the salary that they send out plus $250,000 on top. So from New York's perspective, they're taking in $26.9 million with all 3 players. To absorb all that salary, that means that they have to send out at least $19,395,409. So RJ Barrett's outgoing salary of $23.9 million by itself would be enough to take back all three players. With RJ Barrett's $23.9 million, the Knicks can actually take back a maximum of $31.4 million. That means that Immanuel Quickley's salary would actually be sent out in return for nothing, which in turn creates a traded player exception for the value of Immanuel Quickley's entire salary, which is $4.2 million. And the Knicks will have 1 year to use this, and they can use it to take back salary up to $250,000 more than the value of that trade exception. So they can use it to take back salary worth up to $4.42 million. Now let's take a look at how that trade math works from Toronto's perspective. From Toronto's perspective, they're taking in $28.1 million. And in order to absorb all that salary, they'll have to send out at least $20,555,477. When working out the trade math, you want to first try to make the math work using the smaller salaries and leave the larger salary to create the largest possible traded player exception. But that doesn't work in this case. They need to get up to $20.6 million, and the two smaller salaries only get them up to around $8 million. So in that case, we have to try to use OG's salary. OG Anunoby's contract alone is enough to take back $26.1 million, but that's not enough to take back both RJ and Quickley. However, if you add both OG and Malachi Flynn's salaries, then they have enough to take back both. And then what happens is Precious Achiuwa's salary is essentially sent out for nothing back in return, which creates a $4.3 million traded player exception. And the Toronto Raptors will have 1 year to use this and can use it to take back salary up to $250,000 more than the value of that traded player exception. That means that they can use that traded player exception to take back a salary worth up to about $4.6 million. Now, what does this mean for both teams moving forward? Let's start with Toronto. For Toronto, it all starts with Pascal Siakam, and if he re-signs with Toronto or if he leaves either via trade or free agency. If Siakam leaves, Toronto could create up to $36 million of cap space and also be about $63 million under the luxury tax. Toronto would create this much room because they'd only have Quickley's $12.5 million cap hold, use their cap space, and then sign Immanuel Quickley to a new deal after they use their cap space. The $36 million also assumes that Toronto's draft pick is going to be outside the top 6 and that they're going to lose that first round pick to San Antonio. If they keep their pick, that would actually reduce their cap space to somewhere below $30 million. Now, if they do retain Pascal Siakam, then they're instead going to be operating as an over-the-cap team. Most teams operate over the cap, so this is normal, and Toronto's front office has actually operated that way every single year. If they retain Siakam, assuming he gets max money, then depending on how much they sign Immanuel Quickley for is going to determine how much room they'll have left under the luxury tax. If Quickley is signed for $20 million, for example, then Toronto will have around $15 million under the luxury tax. And if Quickley is signed for about $25 million, then they'll have around $10 million left below the luxury tax. Now let's take a look at what Pascal Siakam's options are moving forward. In the first column, we see what a Pascal Siakam extension with Toronto would look like, and he's able to sign this extension until June the 30th. That would be a 4-year, $190 million extension. This extension would also not be available if Pascal Siakam were to be traded by the trade deadline. In the second column, we see the new contract that Pascal Siakam could sign as a free agent with a brand new team, a team that doesn't have his bird rights. And that would be a 4-year, $183 million contract. If Pascal Siakam signed with bird rights as a free agent, either with Toronto or if he gets traded, then the new team that acquires Pascal Siakam and inherits his bird rights, then he could sign a contract up to 5 years and $247 million. And then in the final column, you see that if Pascal Siakam hits free agency with Toronto that holds his bird rights and earns an All-NBA selection, then he can sign a Supermax deal, which would be worth 5 years and $288 million. Now, this is obviously assuming that Pascal Siakam is going to sign a max contract. And you can obviously see between column 2 and column 3 that if Pascal Siakam signs with his bird rights, it's a significantly larger contract than if he signs with a brand new team under a max contract. $247 million is $64 million more than the max contract he could sign with a new team that doesn't have his bird rights. So even if Siakam is thinking about leaving Toronto, if they have his bird rights, he may be better off signing that max contract for 5 years, $247 million. And if he wants to leave, maybe figuring that part out after. And with respect to Toronto retaining Gary Trent Jr., it's not looking great. If Toronto doesn't retain Pascal Siakam, the way that they get up to that maximum $36 million of cap space is if they renounce Gary Trent's rights. But if they did that, it would be pretty odd for them to turn around and then eat up that cap space by re-signing Gary Trent. And on the other hand, if Toronto does retain Pascal Siakam and gets a top 6 pick, they just won't have enough money to sign Gary and stay below the luxury tax. And if Toronto retains Pascal Siakam and doesn't get a top 6 pick, so they don't have the salary of a first rounder on their books, then they'll have somewhere between $10 to $15 million to use to sign Gary Trent Jr. while staying below the luxury tax. But that range all depends on what they sign Immanuel Quickley for, and that $10 to $15 million may not even be enough to afford Gary Trent Jr. anyway. Now, let's take a look at the Raptors cap situation moving forward. Every move that the Toronto Raptors make moving forward has to be with one eye on the 25-26 season to make sure that they don't go over the luxury tax when Scottie Barnes' extension kicks in. Now, if the Raptors move Pascal Siakam, then they'll be fine. But if they retain Siakam, then things get very tight very quickly for the Raptors. So in order to project what the Toronto Raptors salary cap sheet may look like in the 25-26 season, let's make some assumptions. So first of all, let's assume that Pascal Siakam does re-sign with Toronto on a max deal. Then let's assume that Immanuel Quickley signs for a 4-year, $90 million contract with a salary of around $22 million in the 25-26 season. And let's assume that Scottie Barnes gets the 25% max rookie scale extension. If all these scenarios play out, then the Raptors would be committed to $152.5 million in salaries for just their projected starting lineup. That would be for the 5 players of Immanuel Quickley, RJ Barrett, Scottie Barnes, Pascal Siakam, and Jakob Poeltl. Now, assuming that the Raptors spend all the way up to the luxury tax, which is projected to be around $180 million, that would have the Raptors spending about 85% of their salary just on their starting lineup. And that season, Grady Dick is also projected to make $5 million in the 25-26 season. And then that will put them at just over $22 million to fill out the rest of the roster. And then if you add in a salary for a first round pick and then fill out the rest of the roster with minimum salaries, the Raptors would be on pace to exceed the luxury tax. Moving forward, these are the factors to watch for the Toronto Raptors that could potentially push them over the luxury tax in the 25-26 season. 1, if the salary cap only jumps by 5% as opposed to the maximum of 10%, then that doesn't leave them a lot of breathing room. Number 2, if they get a high first round pick in either the 2024 or the 2025 draft, that salary will put a lot of pressure on their cap sheets. Number 3, if Scottie Barnes makes an All-NBA team and qualifies for the 30% max instead of the 25% max, it increases his salary by over $7 million in the 25-26 season. And then lastly, if they sign Immanuel Quickley for too much money, it's going to add a lot of pressure for the Toronto Raptors against luxury tax in the 25-26 season. Now, let's shift over and look at how the New York Knicks salary cap situation will look moving forward. In order to do so, we also need to make some assumptions there as well. So, first of all, we're going to assume that the Knicks do not pick up Evan Fournier's team option in the 24-25 season. Then we're going to assume that they do re-sign OG Anunoby, and we're going to assume that they re-sign him to a contract around $35 million in average annual salary. And then lastly, we're going to assume that the Knicks end up with 2 first-round picks, one being their own and one being Dallas's, for a total of around $7 million in salary. With all those assumptions, that would put the Knicks committed to about $151 million in salary for just 8 players and put them at around $21 million under the luxury tax. If they then add about 6 more players on minimum contracts, that leaves them just around $10 million under the luxury tax with 1 additional roster spot. Now, a lot of talk around New York has been that their next big move will be to acquire an all-star or a superstar caliber player. But if they do intend to do that, they'll likely try to move some salary off their 2024-25 salary cap sheet in order to duck the luxury tax. Now, a lot of people are putting Evan Fournier in hypothetical trades in order to make the trade math work, which makes sense. But including Evan Fournier's salary doesn't necessarily help them duck the luxury tax in the 24-25 season, because we're assuming that Evan Fournier's contract is already going to be off their books in that season. So let's look at a hypothetical scenario where let's just say that the Knicks trade for a player like DeJounte Murray that's making just over $25 million in salary next season. In that scenario, the Knicks would have to send out enough salary to satisfy the trade math criteria, but they'd also need to send out about an additional $15 million in salary off of their 24-25 salary cap sheets in order to still stay below the luxury tax after acquiring a player like DeJounte Murray. A hypothetical trade that would satisfy that would be them moving Quentin Grimes, Dante DiVincenzo, along with a plethora of draft picks, and taking back DeJounte Murray's $25 million plus contract. If the Knicks do acquire another all-star level player, a hypothetical trade like this will help them stay under the luxury tax in the 24-25 season, but they also have to keep an eye on the 25-26 season. In that season, Jalen Brunson currently has a $25 million player option. However, all signs point to the fact that Jalen Brunson will likely opt out of that and sign a new contract that will start upwards of $40 million. Understanding that that's pretty likely, the Knicks are going to have to make the decision of whether it makes more sense instead to trade a player like Julius Randle to help alleviate more salary in the future, or if they're willing to dip into the luxury tax in the future to keep this team together. But regardless of whether the Knicks are going to have to part with players like Dante DiVincenzo and Quentin Grimes, or a player like Julius Randle, the premise remains the same, that the New York Knicks' next significant move will likely be to acquire an all-star or superstar caliber level player. And the great thing about the position that the Knicks are in is that they have a ton tradable contracts between the ranges of $9 million and $30 million. And when you combine that with the fact that they have a ton of first-round draft capital that they can include in any trade, that's going to allow them to be very aggressive on the trade market and catapult themselves to the next level, either at this trade deadline or in the upcoming offseason.